They were called holy, pure, chosen by the gods. But what if I told you that behind the thick temple walls of ancient Egypt, the word virgin didn't mean what we think it does today? It wasn't about innocence, it was about control. These girls, taken young, were dressed in white and paraded as sacred. But beneath that sacred cloth was a system far darker than most can imagine. Ritual purity was a disguise. Obedience was demanded, and what they called divine service was, in truth, a lifetime of silence, abuse, and stolen freedom. These weren't rare cases. Thousands of young girls, some as young as 8, were handed over to temples not by choice, but as payment. Families traded them for debt, tribute, or favor with the gods. Once inside, their names were taken, their hair removed, their identity erased, and they were never allowed to leave again. What followed wasn't holiness. It was horror wrapped in gold and incense. This isn't myth. This is real, written in temple scrolls and buried in ancient records. And if you think this story is just about ancient rituals, think again. This is what happens when religion becomes power, and power forgets mercy. In the warm air of a spring morning around 1200 BC, a small girl named Nefitari stood in silence inside the temple courtyard of Amun at Karnak. She was only 9 years old. Her dark braids had always been a point of pride, long, neat, brushed daily by her mother. But now, priests circled around her with razors in hand, scraping her scalp clean until not a single strand remained. She didn't understand. All she knew was that her father, a low-level government scribe, had brought her here 3 days ago and hadn't returned. He had spoken softly that day, smiling through guilt. He said the gods had chosen her, that it was a great honor, that she would serve in holiness. But what he didn't say, what he couldn't bring himself to explain, was that he had offered her to the temple as payment for a debt he could no longer repay. No silver, no grain, only his daughter. As the cold blade glided across her head, Nefitari felt the weight of her childhood fall to the ground in quiet piles of hair. Tears welled in her eyes. She didn't understand why she felt so cold. A priestess, tall, expressionless, noticed her sobbing and slapped her hard across the face. "God's servants do not cry," the woman snapped. "You have no tears left. No name. You belong to Amun now. And Amun does not accept weakness." It was the first time Nefitari heard someone say she no longer had a name. But it wouldn't be the last. That moment marked the beginning of a life that would last 43 years. Lived entirely behind painted stone walls, never again walking free. Never marrying, never owning anything, not even her own voice. The outside world would forget she existed. And inside these walls, her body and soul would become the property of the gods. But Nefitari was not alone. Her story was one of thousands. Girls taken while still young, labeled as pure, handed titles like wife of the god, hand of the goddess, or servant of the divine. Words that sounded beautiful, but covered a reality built on suffering. This wasn't worship. This was control, hidden under the glow of sacred fire. And most of them had no choice. Girls like Nefitari were often given away before they even understood what was happening. Families who couldn't afford to pay their debts or wanted fewer mouths to feed turned to the temple as an answer. The priests accepted these offerings gladly. They needed labor, bodies to serve, and girls to be molded. It was all considered legal, blessed by the state and cloaked in religion. But even worse were the girls who had no families at all. They came from far-off lands, Nubia, Libya, Canaan, taken as tribute by Egyptian soldiers. These children were marched for days, sometimes weeks, and handed over to the temples like cattle. Most were under 10. Some hadn't even reached puberty. One of them was an 8-year-old named Mutamuya. She came from a quiet village near the Nile's first waterfall. When soldiers arrived, they took what they wanted: ivory, gold, and children. Tied together with ropes, she and a dozen other girls were forced to walk north, crying and begging in languages the soldiers didn't understand. Mutamuya had no idea where she was being taken. She only knew the life she had was gone. When she cried, a guard hit her and barked, "Silence! You belong to the gods now." From that day on, She cried only in silence. When the group reached Thebes, Mutamuya was handed to the temple of Mut, the goddess of motherhood. The irony would reveal itself in time. She would serve a goddess of mothers, but never be allowed to become one herself. Her new life was beginning, one designed not to raise her, but to strip her down, mentally, physically, emotionally, until there was nothing left but a quiet shell dressed in linen. And soon, the rituals would begin. The first step in turning girls like Nefitari and Mutamuya into temple property wasn't about devotion. It was about breaking them. Every ritual, every so-called sacred act, was built to erase who they had been and create something obedient, silent, and completely owned. It started with water. The priests called it purification, a holy cleansing said to wash away worldly dirt and make the child pure for service. But what it really was something far more invasive. The girl would be brought to a sacred pool, stripped of her clothes in front of strangers, and washed with a harsh mixture of water and natron, a kind of natural salt that burned the skin. They said it was a blessing, but it felt like punishment. When Nefitari stood by the pool for her purification, 3 priests and 2 older women waited. She hesitated, holding her arms across her chest, her small body trembling. One of the women grabbed her and yanked her clothes off like she was a piece of furniture. The water was freezing. A priest stepped into the pool beside her and told her not to move. Then, without warning, he began to touch her. Not gently, not with care, but with the cold inspection of someone looking at livestock. She gasped and stepped back. He seized her arm and spoke with a hard, flat voice. "The gods are watching. They are testing your obedience." Nefitari stood frozen. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. But something inside her shut down. She learned quickly that silence was safer. After the bath came the second step, shaving. Every hair on her body was removed, not just her head, but everywhere. The temple claimed this was for cleanliness, for spiritual reasons, but the truth was far simpler. Hair was personal. It was a sign of identity, of pride, of womanhood. Removing it was a message. You are no longer yours. When Nefitari looked at her reflection in a bronze mirror afterward, she didn't recognize herself. The girl she saw was someone else, someone hollow. Then came the naming, or rather the unnaming. Her real name, the one whispered by her mother in the dark as she was rocked to sleep, was erased. The priests gave her a new one, Nefit. Beautiful is the lady, a name chosen not for her, but for what they wanted her to be. She was told she could never speak her old name again. That part of her life was now dead. With no hair, no name, and no privacy, the child she once was had vanished. What remained was property of the temple, but the most disturbing ritual came after all of this. It was the one they called divine marriage, the holy union between a young girl and the God she would serve for the rest of her life. The priest said it was the highest honor. The child would become a bride of the divine. But what honor is there in a wedding where the bride is too young to even understand the vows? At 10 years old, Mutamuya went through her divine marriage. She was dressed in white linen, her bald head covered by an elaborate wig. Gold ornaments shimmered against her tiny wrists. The high priest led her into a dark sanctuary lit by oil lamps, where the towering figure of the goddess Mut loomed in silence. He chanted in the old tongue, claiming to speak the voice of the goddess herself, and said Mutamuya had been chosen, blessed and purified, to become the goddess's wife. He instructed her to repeat his words, "I take the vows. I give myself to Mut. My body is her temple. My life is her property. I will serve in purity and obedience forever." She repeated every line, her voice barely a whisper. She didn't understand what they truly meant, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that she obeyed. That night her fate was sealed. She would never marry a man. She would never have children of her own. She would never leave. Her body, her choices, even her thoughts, all belonged to the temple now. But there was one thing the priests didn't count on, that somewhere deep inside a memory would remain. A voice, a mother's lullaby, a sense of who she once was, and that fragile spark, buried under silence and shame, would one day try to rise again. Life inside the temple didn't look like slavery on the surface. There were no chains, no shouting overseers with whips. Everything looked calm, clean, sacred. But the truth was, it was a prison, one built not just with stone walls, but with rules, silence, and fear. Every day was exactly the same. Nefitari, the name they gave Nefitari, would wake before sunrise, sleeping among dozens of other girls on tightly packed mats in a cold dormitory. The air always smelled of dust and old oil lamps. Older women, long broken by the same system, watched over them. These women didn't speak much. Most had forgotten what freedom even felt like. The morning began with another cleansing, washes done in silence. Linen robes handed out in rows, all white, all plain. Every girl looking like the next. There was no jewelry, no mirrors, no color. Individuality was stripped away with every detail. Then came the work. Most of the girls were assigned to labor. Endless hours weaving cloth, grinding grain, sweeping floors, or preparing offerings for ceremonies. The priests called it holy service, but it was really just unpaid labor disguised in religion. The girls were not free to stop, not allowed to ask questions, not permitted to complain. But what made it truly unbearable wasn't the physical effort. It was the isolation. They were surrounded by other girls, yet completely alone. They weren't allowed to speak unless directly spoken to. If two girls were caught whispering, even just a few words, the punishment was immediate and brutal. And everyone learned this fast. Nefitari had one friend, a girl named Takayat. She was the only light in Nefit's dark world. They worked side by side at the looms. Sometimes they would exchange glances. Sometimes, if they were sure no one was listening, they would whisper stories, just a sentence or two, about dreams, about family, about what the stars looked like outside the temple walls. But then, one day, they got caught. An older supervisor, a priestess long loyal to the system, spotted them. Without a word, she stepped forward and struck Takayat across the back of her neck with a wooden rod. Takayat dropped her shuttle and collapsed. The room went dead silent. Two guards dragged her away as the overseer shouted, "This is what happens to those who break the silence." For 3 days, Takayat was gone. When she came back, her face was pale, her eyes empty. She didn't whisper anymore. She didn't look up. She barely moved. And 2 months later, she disappeared altogether. The priestess only said, "Takayat was found impure. She has been returned to the gods." No one dared ask what that meant. But everyone knew. The truth was, the temple watched everything. There were eyes in every hallway, every chamber. Girls were never left alone. Guards and priests controlled every movement. They couldn't visit their families, couldn't write letters, couldn't even look out a window. Their pasts were erased. Their futures were decided for them. And then there were the inspections. To make sure the girls remained ritually pure, priests performed regular checks. These were not medical. They were not respectful. They were not voluntary. They were violations. And the worst part, the girls were taught that resisting would offend the gods, that their suffering was sacred, that their silence meant they were holy. Nefitari learned to escape without moving, to let her mind float far away while her body remained still. It was the only way to survive. If a girl cried, she was punished. If she flinched, she was punished. If she dared to show anger or pain, she was punished. With hunger, with beatings, with more labor. But over time, something deeper began to change inside her. She no longer remembered what freedom tasted like. The smell of her mother's cooking, the sound of the river in her village, even her real name, they all became distant echoes. Like dreams slipping away after you wake up, this was no longer just physical captivity. It was mental, emotional, spiritual. The temple had remade her, but even in the darkest places, something stubborn remains. A single thought buried deep inside, this isn't holy, this isn't right, and that tiny flicker of thought, that refusal to completely forget, would one day matter more than anyone could guess. As the years passed, Nefitari grew older, but not freer. Her days were so carefully controlled, so perfectly repeated, that time itself started to blur. Seasons changed outside the temple, but she wouldn't know. The walls never changed, the silence never broke. And the rituals, they only became darker. Inside the temple, a few women were given higher titles, wives of the god, they were called. People outside imagined them as honored priestesses, graceful and respected. But those titles were just a mask. What really happened behind that name was something few dared to speak about. These women were chosen for rituals the priests claimed were sacred, holy unions that reenacted the ancient myths, the marriage of gods and goddesses. They were told it was a blessing, that their bodies were offering fertility to all of Egypt. But the truth was far more disturbing. The high priests believed they were the physical form of the gods during these rituals. They dressed in divine robes. They performed chants. They filled the air with smoke and incense. Then they declared, "Through me the god acts." The women selected for these ceremonies were warned. This was not a choice. To say no would mean punishment, disgrace, or worse. They were told that to resist was to insult the gods, and that a single refusal could bring divine punishment upon everyone. Nefitari was only 14 when she was chosen for her first divine union. She was bathed, dressed in soft linen, her face painted and her body covered in golden jewelry. Her wig was carefully arranged to hide the baldness beneath. It all looked beautiful. But she felt sick inside. She had heard whispers about what this ceremony really was, but no one had ever spoken it clearly. That night, the air inside the temple was thick with burning incense. Drums echoed low in the distance. She was led into the inner sanctuary, where the statue of Amun stood tall and silent. Shadows danced along the walls. The high priest stood before her, wearing an ornate mask, his robe covered in symbols of the divine. He told her the god had chosen her, that she had been found worthy, that this night would bind her to Amun forever. She stood frozen as his hands reached out. When he began to remove her robe, she finally understood. She stepped back instinctively. But 2 other priests moved in, calming her with whispers. "It is the god's will. You will be blessed. Do not be afraid." The high priest warned her softly but firmly. "If you refuse, you curse the god himself." What followed was recorded as a sacred union in temple records. But Nefitari knew the truth. It was not sacred, it was assault, and it was only the first of many. The other women had learned to survive it by going numb, by surrendering, by telling themselves it was holy, even if their bodies screamed otherwise. Some took part in these rituals dozens of times over the years. Each time, a piece of them disappeared. Some even became pregnant. When a temple woman gave birth, the child was called blessed by the gods. But there was no joy, no celebration. The girl was usually allowed to nurse the baby for a short while, but afterward, the child was taken away, raised within the temple system like all the others. At 16, Nefitari found herself in that same position. She was pregnant. She was moved to a separate wing of the temple where other pregnant women lived. There was no comfort there, only waiting. No laughter, just quiet acceptance. One older woman whispered to her, "Don't hope too much. Once your child is strong enough, they will take her." Nefert gave birth to a daughter. For 3 years, she held the little girl, watched her take her first steps, heard her speak her first words. But she always knew the time would come, and it did. One morning, a priest arrived and took the child away. No goodbye, no explanation. Just the sound of tiny footsteps fading down the hall. Nefert tried not to cry. But when she saw her daughter again, dressed in white, her head shaved, walking silently with the other girls, something inside her broke. She had always wondered what her own mother had felt the day she was left at the temple. Now she knew, and the pain was worse than any ritual. The worst thing about the temple wasn't just the pain or the silence. It was how well it taught you to accept things that were never meant to be accepted. Over time, even horror became routine. That's how the system worked. It broke girls early, and then made sure they never had the chance to heal. But sometimes, someone broke the rules, and when they did, the temple made sure every other girl watched what happened next. One afternoon, during a meal, a woman named Renutma suddenly stood up. Her voice was loud, shaking with fury. "This is not holy," she shouted. "These men are not gods. We are prisoners." Everything stopped. No one moved. The room fell into a silence so deep it felt like time itself paused. Renutma didn't run. She knew it wouldn't matter. Within seconds, guards rushed in and grabbed her. She was dragged away without a word. That night, no one spoke her name. But fear was thick in the air. The next morning, the priests forced all the temple women to walk beyond the sacred walls into the desert. There, under the burning sun, they saw what was left of Renutma, her body already torn by animals, her skin scorched and broken. The high priest stood beside her remains and said coldly, "This is the fate of the impure." Let it be a warning. It worked. The silence inside the temple deepened. The fear grew stronger. But something else grew too, something quiet, hidden, hard to kill, a kind of resistance. It wasn't loud. It couldn't be. But it found ways to live. Some girls began weaving small mistakes into the cloth, patterns that spelled silent words like "I resist" or "I remember." Some hummed melodies from their childhood, just low enough not to be heard. Others scratched tiny marks into the stone. Not full names, not full sentences, but enough to say, "I am still here." Even Mutamuya, the girl taken from Nubia so many years ago, still carried her memories like fire inside her. One night, as she sat alone in a dark storeroom, she began to hum a song her mother used to sing, just a few soft notes. But an older woman heard her and reported it immediately. The next morning, she was dragged before the high priest. He slapped her hard. "You have no mother," he said. "You have no name. You have no language but ours." They locked her in a stone room with no windows, no food, and no light. 7 days passed. When she came out, her back was bent. Her voice was gone. She never sang again. The temple didn't just want obedience. It wanted forgetfulness. It wanted every girl to forget her past, her home, her people, her language, even her name. But not all of them did. Some never stopped remembering. And for those girls, survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about keeping some small part of themselves untouched. Nefitari saw it too. In the way a girl paused before praying. In how they held each other's hands during ceremonies when no one was looking. In how, even after years of silence, some still found ways to speak, but they knew better than to raise their voices. They had seen what happened to Renutma, so their rebellion became invisible. It lived in memory, it lived in silence, it lived in knowing that no matter what the priest said, the gods could not possibly want this. Not every woman inside the temple took part in the sacred unions. But for those who did, the horror never truly ended. Some were chosen once, others many times, and every time it happened, a part of them was taken. But what no one outside the temple knew was that those sacred unions sometimes created life. When the women became pregnant, the temple had a system ready. They weren't celebrated. They weren't honored. They were separated, taken to quiet hidden rooms where no outsiders could see. There they waited in silence with other women, all carrying children they didn't choose to create. Nefitari, like many before her, was placed in one of these quarters. There was no comfort, no softness, just long days of waiting. No visitors, no questions answered. An older woman tried to comfort her once, saying gently, "Don't get too attached. Once the baby is strong enough, they'll take her. If it's a girl, she stays here. If it's a boy, the priests will raise him." The older women spoke as if it was normal, because for them it was, and that made it all worse. When Nefitari gave birth, she held her daughter close every moment she could. The tiny girl had her eyes, her nose, and for 3 years, Nefitari lived only for her. She whispered stories into her ears. She hummed lullabies. She even carved a tiny mark into the stone beside her bed, a mark only she would recognize. A mark for her daughter to one day find, but nothing lasts in the temple. One morning, without warning, the child was taken. Nefitari wasn't told where. She wasn't allowed to say goodbye. She wasn't even allowed to ask. Later that week, she saw the girl again. She was walking down a hallway with the other new initiates. Her small head was shaved, her tiny frame wrapped in the white linen of service. She walked in silence. She didn't look up. She didn't see her mother standing just a few steps away, and Nefitari, once Nefitari, had to turn away. Her chest ached with a pain deeper than any wound. That moment was her true breaking. She had survived the rituals, the inspections, the silence, even the sacred unions. But seeing her daughter walking the same path, that was the cruelest thing the temple had done to her, because now the cycle would begin again. Her daughter would be taught to obey, to serve, to forget. She would one day be renamed, purified, married to a god. And she too might one day give birth to a child that would be taken from her. That was the real ritual, not the chants, not the incense, but the cycle. Mothers creating daughters for the temple, sons raised by priests to continue the system. A never-ending chain where every woman was a tool, every child a future offering, and all of it wrapped in holy words. But not all of them forgot who they were, not all of them stayed silent forever. Some kept secrets carved into walls, others left songs buried in the rhythm of their weaving. Some, like Nefert, kept their fire hidden, waiting quietly for the chance to make it known that they had not been erased. Not yet. For most of the women inside the temple, resistance was never loud. It couldn't be. The walls had ears, and the priests had power. But now and then, someone dared to test the line between silence and defiance. Some paid for it with their lives, but some found ways to leave behind a trace. By the time Nefert turned 40, she had seen everything. She had witnessed girls arrive in fear and slowly disappear into silence. She had watched friends vanish without explanation. She had helped prepare young initiates for rituals she couldn't speak of. And she had seen her own daughter begin to fade into the same silence she once fought against. But in the darkest parts of the temple, there were signs that not all had accepted their fate. Inside the weaving hall, a cloth was found with a deliberate mistake in the pattern. A single thread twisted into the symbol for the word free. The priest overseeing the room noticed and tore it apart. No one admitted to it. But every woman who saw it knew exactly what it meant, and in a storeroom behind the eastern sanctuary, carved deep into a dusty stone wall, were 4 small words: "We are still here." Someone had taken a risk. Someone had remembered. It gave Nefert something she hadn't felt in years, a reason to keep going. But not everyone wanted to remember. Some of the older priestesses had been there so long they couldn't imagine another life. They believed the priests spoke for the gods, that this was simply the way things were, that suffering was sacred and obedience was holy. So they taught the same lessons to the younger girls, not out of cruelty, but out of habit. Out of fear, but not Nefert. She began to whisper when she thought no one could hear. Just a few quiet words of truth. She told one young girl, "You had a mother. You had a name. You were loved." She told another, "The gods didn't ask for this." Men did. It was dangerous. But it mattered, because once a girl heard those words, something changed. Maybe not on the outside, but inside. A wall cracked. A thought stayed. A memory returned. And slowly, a quiet rebellion grew. No swords, no fire. Just truth, passed in secret, carried like a flame. Even Mutamuya, now an old woman with tired hands and sad eyes, began to remember the sound of her mother's voice. She had forgotten the words long ago, but not the feeling, not the warmth. One evening, when the temple was asleep, she walked alone into a forgotten chamber beneath the archives. There, using a sharp piece of broken pottery, she scratched a message into the stone. "I came from beyond the first waterfall. My mother's name was Mutamuya. I remember her voice. I never forgot who I was before they took me. This life was not my choice. If you find this, know that I lived. Know that I remembered." She didn't expect anyone to read it. She only needed to say it. 2 days later, she died. No ceremony. No name written down. Just her body placed in a plain grave with 3 others. Forgotten, but her words remained. Nefert found them weeks later. And when she read them, something inside her steadied. It was like hearing someone speak out loud what she had kept locked away for decades. She placed her hand over the message, then carved 3 more words beside it. "You were seen," she never told anyone. But from that moment on, she knew what she had to do before she died. She had to make sure they were remembered. Nebet, the girl once named Nefitari, lived to be 52. She had served the temple of Amun for over 4 decades. She had been a child bride of the gods, a servant, a laborer, a mother who could not mother, and a woman stripped of name, choice, and freedom. But even as her body aged and her voice faded, one thing inside her stayed alive: memory. In her final years, she walked the temple halls slower than before, but she paid attention. She noticed the girls, the ones just beginning the same journey she had started as a child. She saw how their hands trembled, how they cried in secret, how they flinched at every command. And she remembered, so she did what she could, a whispered word here, a gentle touch there, a look that told them, "You are not alone." She told them what others had once told her, that they were born free, that this wasn't the gods' will, that their pain wasn't sacred, and that remembering mattered. When she felt her end was near, she prepared quietly. No one would honor her. No one would mark her grave. She would be buried like all the others, in a nameless pit, under the temple that had taken everything from her. But before that day came, she returned to the secret chamber where Mutamuya had carved her name. The wall was now covered with faint scratches, some messages too worn to read, others just lines, marks, symbols. But each one whispered the same thing: "We were here." Nefert pressed her palm to the stone. Then with a piece of broken tile she scratched in her final words, "My name was Nefitari. I was not born for this. I was taken. But I remembered. Even when they tried to make me forget, I remembered." She didn't write more. She didn't need to. She died 3 weeks later. Her body was placed in a shallow grave beside 3 other women. No coffin, no prayers. Her daughter, now a temple woman herself, was forbidden to grieve, forbidden to speak, forbidden to remember. The high priest simply said, "Forget her. She has returned to the gods." But not everyone forgot, not completely. In secret, girls continued to visit the wall. They traced the carvings with their fingers. They added their own marks, hidden, simple, but powerful. Small signs that they still remembered who they were, even when the world tried to erase them. Years passed, then centuries. The temples fell into ruin. The gods were forgotten, but the stones remained, and carved into those stones, beneath the dust and silence, are whispers of lives that refused to vanish. Girls who were taken, women who were used, mothers who never stopped loving, souls who never stopped resisting. So today, when visitors walk through the ruins of Karnak, when they marvel at the pillars and the painted walls, they rarely wonder what those stones witnessed. They don't see the pain behind the beauty. They don't hear the voices that were silenced. But now, you do. You know that behind every carving, every statue, every chant once sung in a forgotten tongue were girls like Nefitari and Mutamuya. And they deserve to be remembered. They weren't symbols. They weren't sacred objects. They were people, and they mattered.